I'm Jeremy Molho. So this is the last panel of the day after this very inspiring panel on art and migration narrative. Now we are going to go back to a more academic panel, which so the title is Migration Narrative in Emerging Regional Powers. And so as Anna said this morning, one of the key objectives of this conference is to decenter migration narratives. And so already in the panels today, we have had a lot of decentering by reflexively looking at migration narratives. But today, and also like in this panel and also in the following panels tomorrow, what we're going to have a lot is decentering narratives by looking at migration is framed in other places in the world. And especially in places in the global south, without looking at it from a Western perspective of looking at migration as essentially only coming from south to north, but also trying to look at other ways of framing and understanding migration. We have talked a lot about framing in the previous panel from a literal point of view, but it's also a useful metaphor to look at how migration narratives are produced. So in today's panel, we're going to be looking at a different world region. So we're going to look at Turkey, North Africa, Africa, and look at how migration, immigration, emigration is framed in these places, how autonomous and specific migrant narratives are produced in these places, and to what extent they challenge Western-centric narratives, or sometimes also reinforce some of these pre-existing narratives. So we are very fortunate to have a panel with 4 scholars tonight, one of whom is online. So our first speaker who is joining us on Zoom is Zeynep ahin-Mencu from Bonn International Centre for Conflict Studies and CERC Migration. And she will speak on Turkey's migration narrative and strategic temporality. Then we will listen to Mehdi Lahlou from National Institute of Statistics and Applied Economics in Rabat, and he'll present on the myth of migration and development in Morocco. Then we'll hear from Andrei Korobkov from Middle Tennessee State University, and he'll share his research on evolving migration narratives in Russia. And finally, Loren Landau from the University of Oxford and of Witwatersrand. He'll present on countering containment and combating representation of migrant immoralities, looking at EU-Africa relationships. So without further ado, I will give the floor on Zoom to Zeynep. So please, Zeynep, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeremy, and hello everyone from Bonn, Germany. And we are in an evening here, and wish you a good evening as well. And let me start with my presentation. Yes. Yeah, I'm going to talk about Turkey's migration narratives in general, and also introduce to the one concept we are working on called strategic temporality. Actually, many of the arguments you are going to listen from me is already written in our new book called Syrian Refugees in Turkey, which is very recently published by the EMISCO Springer series. And I would like to also thank for CERC for supporting me in this publication process. And the book and also the work on the Turkey's migration governance is the part of the previous Horizon project I was involved in called Respond, and also the ongoing project called GAPS, which many colleagues, including Mehdi and Bernadette and Anna, are the part of it. And let me just start very brief context of the migration patterns in Turkey. And as you know, mentioned in the very beginning, it is very difficult to right now to identify the countries are either as an origin country or a destination country. Turkey is a very prominent example of these mixed migration patterns. It is a truly a destination country for right now for millions of asylum seekers and mainly to Syrians, displaced Syrians. Since 2011, found refuge in Turkey, along with other neighboring countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. But among all these countries, Turkey is the one who got to the most populous Syrian displaced people, and the numbers are around 3.5 million Syrians have been living in Turkey since 2001. And making Turkey the largest hosting country worldwide. And in addition to the Syrians, and actually the Syrians in Turkey are not officially called as refugees, rather they are called those under temporary protection status because of Turkey's geographical reservation over the Geneva Convention. And in addition to the Syrians, Turkey is also kind of destination country for other asylum seekers, mainly from those coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and some other Asian and African countries. And the numbers of the asylum seekers, which is very contested issue, statistics are not that much clear about them, but their numbers are around, the 300,000, but since 2018, Turkey is not that much registering to these asylum seekers, which is officially under the temporal protection status. Not only the destination for the asylum seekers, Turkey is also well known from the transit hub. Transit country for many so-called irregular migrants from Asia, specifically from South Asia like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, as well as those coming from Iraq, Syria, and some African countries. The country is also known as the country of origin for asylum seekers and the skilled migrants. And for instance, when you look at the latest numbers about the asylum applications in European countries, specifically in Germany and Sweden, you are going to see that the citizens of Turkey are among those applied to the asylum in Europe, in the increasing numbers in the last years, but not millions, but yeah, compared to the Syrian population, it is still less, but still they made a substantial number. So when we, here I will more focus on the Turkey's narratives on immigration, specifically it is narratives and the policy and politics on the Syrian refugee migration. And Turkey has also, the different narratives about immigration and it being a transit, but the scope of my presentation is more on immigration. And the country has, the very complex landscape of policies and practices, and also the different experiences of the asylum seekers and those under temporary protection regimes like Syrians. And the one drivers of this complexity is the issue is not just a technical issue for countries like Turkey, but also it is very much entangled with the issues around security, economy, and societal dynamics. And considering that the volume of the refugee migration is very high, at the same time, these migration flows is coming just very close neighborhood of the Turkey, those countries who share a border with Turkey like Iraq and Syria. And there is too much, linked with the border security and the discourses around the Turkey's national security, specifically the Kurdish question is often at the center of these narratives about migrants as well. And if we want to, examine into the Turkey's response or the general narratives and the policy, I think we need to a little kind of unpack what we mean by this response. And in order to unpack, I suggest, that at least, look at the reception, protection, integration phases in a side by side, but also to acknowledge from the very beginning that none of these policies or narratives are linear. They are full of, the ruptures and changes over time. because we are talking right now in a year's 12 years of hosting or having Syrian refugees in the country, and the policies have many fluctuations. And these fluctuations depend on many structural factors, but at the same time, the interactions between the different scales in terms of, the country's geographical considerations and its relations both with the Middle East as a refugee origin region, but also to its relations with the EU, and also to how the policies are translated at the local level and how the individuals are also, the kind of reacting the policies. So, in order to better understand this landscape, I engage with the discussions and the literature about refugee governance, politics of migration, but at the same time, agency and the belonging of the migrants. And those who are in academia probably very well known that there are too many articles and publications right now about the Syrian refugees, and articles are engaging with different conceptual frameworks like liminality, precarity, local tone, institutional ambiguity, which I found, the very complementing conceptual frameworks. From here, I want to, the kind of offering another very much novel, but still, the meaningful concept, which I called strategic temporality. I think the strategic temporality term is helping us to see, or at least identify the general trend and also the changes of the policies and the politics. And I argue that the temporality is actually is not just a natural order of the things. It is also as a governance strategy that is intentionally produced to control and manage the refugee situations. And it has some historical roots and historical examples, but at the same time, it is turning into a very common, as we observe in the Turkey's response. And this strategic temporality has some institutional, legislative, and discursive components. And these components can be traced in the reception policies or protection policies, as well as to the integration policies. In the reception policies, we see often ad hoc practices are on the play, and institutional, the camps, refugee camps are the kind of, the first reactions to give into the refugee migration. And the temporary protection, in terms of protection, which is very prominent in Turkey, is a temporary protection status in the legislation, which was first introduced with the arrival of the Syrians. It was there for a long time, and there was discussions about that. But when Turkey encountered with the Syrians' arrival, it mobilized this status, actually imitating the EU's temporary protection directive, and which is also showing us a kind of these interactions at the different scales. In terms of integration, we also see, the very much uncertainties and ambiguities about these integration policies, which could be defined as not only an integration, but also we see traces of disintegration, exclusion as a spectrum. Actually, in the official language of the Turkish policies, it doesn't call integration. The phenomenon is called social harmony, and which has also, there's some connotations, which I will be a little, touched in this slide on policy and the political narratives. And as I said, the strategic temporality is a strong discursive strategy, and the discourses and the migration narratives are very much in the service of the policies. And these discourses are revolved around the terms like hospitality discourses domestically, but at the same time, moral responsibility and humanitarianism discourses internationally. I want to, make this distinction because we know these framings, the things are framed also according to who is the audience, right? And in the case of the Turkey's political elites, actually, I should maybe underline that I focused on the discourses of the political elites as well as to the, the street level bureaucrats. And we see that these hospitality discourses are put in the circulation domestically, but while international, like in the UN platforms or when the negotiating with the EU, Turkey is much more using this moral responsibility and humanitarianism discourse. And this domestic hospitality discourse is linked with very deeply rooted values like Turkish hospitality, Muslim fraternity, generosity, and has a very prominent religious credential. Actually, during the time of the Prophet Muhammad has been so much referred when the politicians are talking about how we should treat the Syrians, and we should treat the Syrians in a way that how the Prophet Muhammad was treated when he was and his friends migrated to the Medina from Mecca. And these narratives actually work in a way to kind of mediate the public's potential outcry about the arrivals of the migrants. And it also, they give a momentum and some impetus to the local to embrace to the arrival of the refugees. But on the other side, when it comes to international platforms, Turkey is more likely to follow up these moral responsibility, moral superiority, or moral high ground discourses. Actually, it's also important to underline that Turkey didn't use this terminology of the crisis, and it has very much avoided use to this term that Syrian refugees arrival, even in millions. It is not a crisis. It is not framed as a crisis, which is something good. And however, like in other discourses, these pro-refugee narratives and the welcoming approaches did not last long in the case of Turkey as well. And in the over the course of time, specifically since 2018, we see, the more anti-refugee narratives in the political sphere. And these, this is first started with this cost calculations that, how much money we are spending for Syrians, and also it brought some callings for more restrictive policies. Over the time, these turn into the hostility towards Syrians, discriminations, xenophobia, or stereotyping, and then lately, in the last 2 years, is more scapegoating for the Syrians for structural problems in Turkey, like inflation or unemployment. And as these narratives are also not just narratives, right? They are also feeding to the policies and bringing new policy tries, like rushing for repatriation and the calls for reconstruction in the northern Syria to prepare the ground for the rush and immature returns. And the issues came into very sensitive in the election times, as we are right now in Turkey right now in the very, in this Sunday there will be an election, and the issues around the Syrians are in the very center of the election campaigns of the opposition parties, plus the two government party right now. And the discourses also have a huge impact on the individuals, in this case, the Syrians themselves, and created, the many challenges in their access to the labor market and in the education, housing, health, and the citizenship sectors. And due to the legal precarity, the status of temporary protection, but also to, this increasing hostility towards them, we see, many Syrians are experiencing very insecure situations, which creates in turn anxiety and uncertainty for refugees, and very much being between positions and not being sure about what kind of future waits to them. But at the same time, as it is at 12 years, and we see a kind of silent or de facto integrations happens in some situations, but it is very fragile as the policies are changing in another direction. I want to conclude with this last, with some last verse. And although these narratives as well as policies seems very context specific, and in this case, Turkey and the Syrian refugees, but I see a kind of a very general trend towards these temporary protection regimes and the strategic use of the refugee hosting. And in some sense, temporary protection as a status, something not bad, as we see in Ukrainians, and they were they kind of facilitating to, the welcoming to refugee groups like Ukrainians. But at the same time, it is creating too much uncertainty and an ambiguity in the protracted situations. And actually, many of the refugee situations are protracted, right? And remember Palestinian refugees, Afghans, Iraqis, and right now the Syrians. And these years of waiting on an uncertainty and ambiguity is not something, preferable. And at the same time, this temporary and strategic usage of this temporariness seems that it is giving more power to the states, the hosting states, to just bypass to the refugee protection regimes and the bypass to the, the international law and human rights. At the same time, it gives them a more leverage to kind of negotiate over refugees and to use both threat or other mechanisms to in the negotiations. I'm going to stop here, and thanks for listening. If you have questions, I would love to respond in the Q&A section.
So thank you very much, Zeynep. Now we will listen to Mehdi Lahlou, who will come
here. Okay. Yeah, thank you. مساء الخير. أنا مهدي لحلو من المغرب، من الرباط. أنا أستاذ بالمعهد الوطني سابقا للإحصاء والاقتصاد التطبيقي. Hello everyone. I'm Mehdi Lahlou from Rabat, Morocco, and I'm a previous teacher at the National Institute of Statistics and Applied Economics for about 40 years, and also former teacher in Paris, the University of Paris, Paris North 8, University of Paris North for about 3 years, and lived there for 10 years. And so as an ancient student, at that time, we didn't speak about migrant for students, that's ancient student, and also for having living in Morocco and working in Morocco for about now 40 years and studying economical situation, the reason of the migration, the situation of the labor market, but also the political situation in Morocco as an underdeveloping country where there is a lack of freedom, a lack of democracy, and a similar authoritarian system. I know, according to that, what are the drivers of the migration historically since the beginning of the independence, the last 40 years of the last century until now. Hello, Zeynep. We're working together, yes, on a project on the reintegration of migrants with Anna and others from Poland, from Afghanistan. It's a new country, Afghanistan, in this subject of migration and integration. It's very important. I will come back to this subject after that. Thank you, Anna, for this invitation. I'm happy to be here. Very happy as that gives me another opportunity to visit this very nice city of Toronto and very nice country of Canada, which is one of the winner of the migration, actual migration. As we heard a lot of things yesterday, a lot of success stories, individual, collective, and the public stories. And I will give you some ideas and some reflection from the South, from the global South, where we have the winner of migration. When we have the winner of migration, as when we speak as a commercial, as a trade in a trade approach, we have this unbalanced connection or relationship between a global north as a winner of the migration and global south as the loser of migration. I tell you about that. Normally, my presentation was about the title is the question migration and development in Morocco, and that could be also in Africa, in some countries in Asia, and in many countries in Latin America. Is there any connection between development and migration, and is migration a factor of development? For me, it's a myth. It's a real myth. That was true. That was a real situation for countries like this a recent past of countries like Portugal, like Spain, like Italy, like Greece, for namely, as they were very important sending countries. But when these countries start to be democratic countries, and when they integrate the European Union by the 70s and the 80s of the last century, they start to be receiving countries, continuing to be sending countries, but in some equal exchanges between them and the rest of the European Union and the rest of the world. Now, when it comes to countries like Morocco, like Tunisia, even like Algeria or Niger, which is the main important exporter of uranium to France, Niger, who gave France its independence on energy and electricity, but Niger today is one of the poorest country all around the world, the poorest country of around the world. But why? Because the situation of this country didn't change for long years. And as the demographic growth is one of the highest in the world, and as France didn't give anything from the uranium, anything important from the uranium to this country stay till now a poor country and is a sending country to the north or to the other northern African countries like Algeria, like Morocco, like Tunisia, but also to all the rest of Europe. By the beginning of the 60s in Morocco, we decided, under the indication of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and we will find this International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as the counselor of a lot of African, Asiatic, and Latin American countries. They told the Moroccan authority to have an open economy. As you are poor, as you do have a problem of labor in the labor market, as you have sun, as you have a great number of population, you should orient your economy to the external market. You should orient your population to, part of them, to the exportation of the human capital. And you should also open your economy to tourism and to exportation agriculture. Don't go to the infrastructure, don't go to the heavy industry, don't go to the education, or at least, go only to some fundamental school that will be enough for you. You don't need the other things, as we will send to you all what you are in need for: material of construction, material of transportation, and also food. If you need food, we will send you that. And so Morocco, as many of other African countries at other part of the world, start to receive tourists, start to export from their agriculture, and start also to go to manage an immigration policy. And I give you some indication from Morocco. By the end of the last century, the number of migrants from Morocco, mainly in Europe, was about 1 million to 1.5 million. And they were mainly oriented to France and the small part to Belgium, to Holland, or a very small part to Germany. But after that, now it's in 2023, there are about 5 million people outside. Some of them are in Canada, some of them are in the United States of America, but a lot of them, the most important part in Europe and the other part in the Arab countries. That means that the migration produces more migration. It produces more and more migration. As the economical situation didn't change, a lot of people are still willing to migrate. And what we have, we constatation today is not, we don't have only irregular migrant. We don't have only illiterate migrant. We do have women, young women also, and we have very high skilled migrant. I told you that the number of migrants today from Morocco are about 5 million. 10%, between 10 and 15% of them are high-skilled migrants. A lot of them are working in Quebec, in the aeronautic industry. A lot of them are working today in Alberta, for telling you about what happened in Canada. In Alberta, in Vancouver, in Saskatchewan, in the artificial intelligence, in higher technology, in energies. And when you win that, and when you receive these human resources from country like Morocco, that means that Morocco is losing these human resources, to develop its proper industry and its proper economy. And till now, migration is considered as a facility given our authorities, our government, some area of spread of bread to finance external exchange or to finance the deficit of the external exchange. Now, when it comes, it's sure that it's the problematic of migrant, it's an individual one. But it's also a social one. It's also a public one. And it's an individual, it's a people one, it's very complex. It's a very complex political and social issue. And when it comes to this global issue in the European countries, in Canada, in the United States of America, in the OCDE, and globally, they consider, but the migration, it's a part of the global freedom. Everyone has to move everywhere he wants and to stay everywhere he wants. But when it comes to the forced migration, when it comes to irregular migration, the same consider that the South countries has to block their borders, has to reintegrate their migrants, not the high-skilled migrant, but the irregular one, the one that they don't have any need for. And also they have to decide to follow a politic which is in conformity with their will and with their interest, it should happen today for Morocco in its relationship with Europe. It's what happened also today, and you see what is happening in Tunisia, between Tunisia and Italy. Italy is supporting now an illiberal government in Tunisia because Tunisia is blocking, or has to block, its border with in the Mediterranean Sea, between the Mediterranean and Italy and the rest of Europe. Now, as I don't have only 2 minutes, I come very quickly to one. Every point is a chapter. It's a long discussion about every point. Now, when it comes to conclusive ideas, I think that what are migrants looking for? Better salaries, better jobs, and also freedom, and to live in peace, and to live in with protected right. And what we have to do in the southern part, in this global south, is to manage to access to this situation, to give good jobs, to give good salaries, and to give, among all and before all, freedom and democracy. Freedom and democracy. And we don't have the feeling that countries like the United States of America, even with Biden administration or a lot of European countries, are willing that democracy should be the rule of law in the global south. Now, in a global approach, we know that by 2018, there were an agreement on this global pact on regular migration and safe migration that was signed in Marrakesh under the lead of Germany and Morocco. Now, what has to be added to this global pact is 3 or 4 ideas. The first one for the international community is to contribute to reduce insecurity and instability around the world. I told you about Afghanistan. Afghanistan wasn't an immigrant country. We know what happened in Afghanistan since 1979 and what happened in Afghanistan since 2001. Syria was not a country of immigration, migration. We know what happened in Syria after the Iraqi war, the American war on Iraq on 2003 and after 2011. Libya wasn't also a country of migrants. It started to be once after what happened, not only on 2011, but before 2011, according to the relationship between countries like Italy under the government of Berlusconi, and also the government of France under the direction of Sarkozy. And why they destroyed Libya and how Libya started to be a problem of migration in the Mediterranean. So to reduce the insecurity in the global south, to contribute to reduce the drivers of migration from this global south, and also to contribute to build democracy and the state of rule in our countries. I'm sorry if that was too long. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mehdi. Now we will give the floor to Andrei Korobkov, who will speak on the evolving migration narrative in Russia.
Yeah, and some qualifications here. I'm talking about politics and policies, so sorry, my slides are not as beautiful as those of many others, and they're taken from a much longer manuscript that I'm working on. Well, I think that the idea to put a number of countries on one panel dealing with the issue of very quick change in the position in the world migration chain is very important and very useful. Russia belongs to one of such countries. And what's interesting, it did not simply become a country of migration. It changed its role in the migration change from that, while losing migrants to other parts at that time of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, to a center of one of 4 largest immigration systems in the world, the Eurasian system. And it happened during a very brief period of time, resulting in not simply the reversal of migration flows, but in a very quick formation of policies and structures, not always very successful one. And well, at present, Russia plays all 3 major roles in migration chain. It's a country of out-migration, immigration, and a country of migrant transit. Well, if you look at this table, you would see the general composition of population in the Soviet republics right before the dissolution. You can see that the share of ethnic Russians in Russia proper was 81.5%. In roughly speaking, 4 out of 5 people were ethnic Russians. But in Ukraine, the share was 22%, and special cases represented Latvia, where the share of titular nationality was 52%, and Kazakhstan, where the share of ethnic Kazakhs declined to 39.7%. Among other reasons, it was related to the fact that Kazakhstan became a giant place of exile during Stalin's time, when not simply people, but whole nationalities were dumped there as a part of program of punished peoples. But the most important issue is the general typology. So on the one hand, as we have just mentioned, Russia belongs to countries that have very quickly changed their position in the migration chain. On the other hand, Russia represents a pretty typical case of post-imperial, post-imperial dissolution, nation and state formation in the whole post-Soviet space, with some very painful processes related to attempts at nation and state building. As you can see, nation and state building under the conditions when many of those countries have highly mixed population. And if we go a little further and look here, concentration of the major post-Soviet ethnic groups in their native countries. 54 million people in the Soviet Union at the end of USSR existence lived outside their titular nation state. So overnight they became foreigners in countries where very frequently they were born and that they perceived as their own. It included 25 million ethnic Russians with some very significant consequences for the future. Just one more table that shows that there were additional complicating factors. The share of the nationally mixed families in the former Soviet Union, again at the moment of dissolution. You can see in Russia it was close to 15%. In Ukraine, a quarter of all marriages were ethnically mixed. Well, it had significant impact on what would happen afterwards. If we look at the events of the last year, Putin has two major premises. The first one was formulated in 2007 during his now pretty famous and infamous Munich speech, when he said that, well, the Eurocentric world is coming to an end. It's time to incept the multipolar system, and he would play a major role in its creation. His second line of reasoning is related to the idea of the formation of Russian nation state. Very frequently, you can hear about Putin planning to, rebuild the Soviet Union. This is not so. He is concentrated on the idea of building a greater Russian state for a greater Russian nation. He started speaking recently about the triune Russian nation consisting of great Russians, small Russians, and white Russians. So Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, whereas he basically perceives the other two groups as Russians with a speech defect. This is a kind of background of what's going on. We said that at present we see a huge reversal of migration trends in the former Soviet space and specifically in Russia. But what were the trends that existed initially? They were typical for an imperial structure, even before the proclamation of the empire as such. Essentially, the cutoff moment here is 1550, when Ivan the Terrible's troops cross Volga River, occupy a set of Islamic states on the left bank of the river, and start expansion into areas that were ethnically, religiously and racially distinct. Even though Russia from the very inception, the Kievan Rus yet, represented a mixture of various Slavic and non-Slavic, primarily Finno-Ugoric tribes. So migration was taking place for roughly 1,000 years within a closed system. And the essence of this migration was primarily the movement of ethnic Russians, first of all, elites, from the historical center of the country to the ethnic periphery, with some very limited and controlled by the state exchanges from with the outside world. Essentially, we know about some examples, and interestingly enough, the first historically proven case of professional elite migration to Russia was that of Rurik himself, who founded the first Russian dynasty in the year 862, and who was a typical soldier of fortune, a Viking, not surprisingly. In a very similar fashion, in 1698, Ivan Tsar Boris Godunov has sent 5 young nobles to study in Britain. It wasn't a very successful experiment because all 5 have stayed in London, never came back. But overall, that was the essence of the process. So movement to the ethnic periphery of the country that was to a large extent controlled by the state, and that was not allowed to leave the borders of that state. The Bolsheviks have essentially retained this model, increasing the repressive character of migration control. So there was a very massive movement of people, but primarily it was a movement of Russian-speaking elites to the periphery of the country that resulted in, the situation that we already have discussed. There were 3 major waves of external migration. First, resulting from the revolution and the civil war, when about 2 million people, primarily the representatives of elites, have left, up to 1922. The movement after World War II, close to 5 million people have left in various ways. And then the ethnic immigration that was allowed in the 1970s, when roughly 500,000 people, primarily belonging to such minority groups as Jews, Armenians, Greeks, Spaniards, some others were allowed to leave. And then there starts a reversal of these policies under Gorbachev. What is interesting, this reversal took place already in the last 20 years of the USSR existence, and was the direct result of the nationalizing policies of the late Soviet period. Specifically, Russian-speaking elites started leaving the ethnic republics, going to Russia as well as Ukraine and Belarus. So they started a reverse movement. And then there comes the end of the USSR. As I mentioned, overnight, 54 million people find themselves living in countries that were not their newly formed titular states. And Russia at this moment, as the post-Soviet space in general, more or less repeat those trends that took place before in other dissolving empires. So be it the UK, be it the French Empire, but first of all, the territorially contiguous ones, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and especially Turkey. There were two stages. For first half of the 1990s, very quick return, politically motivated and permanent one, of people belonging to the former master nation, so Russians, but also Russian speakers. And it's an important distinction. So people who did not belong to ethnic Russians, but were still minorities in the newly forming states, including, interestingly, those representatives of the titular nations that were educated, say, in Russian universities and were losing their priority status in the newly forming countries. For example, in Kazakhstan, there emerges a distinction between white and black Kazakhs, with white Kazakhs meaning, well, culturally Russian ones. So they also very frequently were living. And this trend that lasted for about 3 to 4 years was very quickly replaced by a new one. Whereas already the titular nations of newly formed states start to move, they move primarily to Russia for economic reasons, and it's a temporary and primarily economically motivated migration. As a result of that, at the peak of the process, Russia had about 12.3 million migrants, so people who were not born in the territory of the RF. But simultaneously, it also lost about 10 million people who, vice versa, went to other republics, former Soviet republics, or went abroad. As a result, for example, the Russian elite diaspora abroad, so the diaspora of people having at least university education, by 2011 was about 660,000. Considering the migration of the past year, it probably has grown to 1 million, moving Russia from the category of countries with large to a category of countries with extra large elite diasporas, countries like India, China, the Philippines, but also the UK and Germany. And then there come, so Russia becomes a center of the system. It receives very large numbers of migrants, primarily labor migrants, but it also loses, migrants, first of all, the elites. And even in the 1990s, it was a country in deep crisis that was losing elites because primarily of the push factors. Then in the first 15 years of the current century, it turned into a country of the middle level of development that loses its elites to other countries, but replenishes these losses by receiving people from, first of all, the post-Soviet region, but also about 500,000 migrants in Russia right now are people who came from outside the post-Soviet region. Countries like China, Vietnam, North Korea, and a number of others. And then there came war in Ukraine, and there were two waves of immigration, both spontaneous, both very intensive, but very short ones. As a result of that, at least according to my estimates, about 500,000 people have left, but they found themselves in a situation that is very different from what happened in the 1990s. In the 1990s, living were people primarily related to 4 groups, mathematicians, physicists, biologists, and chemists. They relied on well-developed schools, including those in the military-industrial complex. It was relatively easy to find jobs for them, and they were primarily finding these jobs in Western Europe and in North America. They accounted for 70% of all migrants belonging to this category. At present, people who leave go to the neighboring countries that are much weaker economically, the Baltics, the Caucasus, Central Asia, Mongolia, and a number of others. They primarily have, diplomas in social sciences and the humanities, and it would be much harder for them to find permanent employment or to settle in those countries. And therefore, in general, most probably, Russia would retain its position as the center of this system. But in general, this was a period, the last 30 years, during which Russian leaders could capitalize on the dissolution of the USSR and bring large numbers of migrants while accommodating them. This was not done for various reasons, including the xenophobia of both elites and society. And in general, Russia has lost its opportunities that it could capitalize on. It increasingly has to compete with countries that initially were the source countries of migration to it. It includes Kazakhstan, it includes Belarus, and potentially it can include China. And on this optimistic note, I'm getting signals that it's time to wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrei. And so now we listen to Loren Landau.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to Anna for the invitation to be here, although I don't know what I did to you for you to put me at this last session between everybody and the using that drink coupon that you gave them. Yeah, so I'll try to be quick and try to, there we go, and try to show a lot of pictures to help get us through this last session. I'm presenting this having worked on African migration, and so I'll talk a little bit differently than the others, not exclusively about South Africa, although that's where I've been based for the most part of the last 20 years, working on questions of migration, migration policy, but also being increasingly and actively involved in what might be considered migrant rights campaigns or trying to reform migration policy in ways that are a little bit more humane, a little bit less xenophobic, and a little bit more attuned to what South Africa and the African continent might benefit from. What we've seen, however, is that perhaps not just my efforts, but all of us who are working on the migrant rights sector in South Africa are losing. We are failing in our efforts to address what is a serious migration issue. South Africa has the largest number of African migrants of any country in the world. Used to be Cote d'Ivoire, goes back and forth, but let's say South Africa for my point of argument. It also has about a 35 or 45% unemployment rate, right? So you can imagine these are tense times, these are difficult times. It's hard to make an argument that you can in Canada or Italy or New Zealand that you need immigrants. But it is nonetheless a country that has been built by immigration. It's a country that has continues to benefit actually from very highly skilled immigration from elsewhere. But we're seeing increased hostility towards immigrants from all sectors, all parties getting on board, all parties fighting to see who can be most xenophobic, who can kick out the foreigners, who can think about building the bigger wall. This kind of narrative has been completely widespread and normalized across South Africa. And the truth is, it's being normalized across much of the continent, right? This is not racism in the way that we see in England or in the United States against Black and brown people coming in. It is rather a kind of xenophobic nationalist or more parochial kind of discrimination against people who move. And I think this has given me reason to question, what is it that we've done wrong, right? What is it about the narratives of scholars, of academics and others that has so completely failed to address the issues of immigrants, immigrant rights, and to try to protect the vulnerabilities that they face. And I think part of it is the way in which we speak about migrant rights, the way in which we have campaigned for migrant rights, the way in which we have often spoken down to xenophobic people, right? And the way in which we continue to do our research and communicate it to the public. So in this way, I'm fully on board with the conversation from the artists earlier in the day, but I think we all of us as scholars are increasingly imbricated in political economies of knowledge, activism, language, which ultimately may do more harm than good, or certainly is not doing any good if it's not doing any harm, right? And so part of what I am suggesting, and I'll try to make this argument a little bit more as I go along, is that we as scholars need to be a little bit more aware of the approaches that we take, and take an approach that really temporalizes and recognizes many more dimensions of the migration discourse and the anti-migration discourse than we typically have, and to think about the way in which we are making ourselves complicit in the kind of nationalist narratives that we see around the world. This is particularly important at a time in Africa, where migration research, African migration kind of discussions are at the front of domestic, regional, and international public policy discussions as never before. They're also at the front of research. There are dozens of new migration research centers popping up all over Africa, which as a migration researcher at one level is a good thing, but we need to look at who is funding them and why they are coming on board. And it is primarily the European Union, the United States, the UK, who are funding these migration research centers, and they are funding them with a purpose, right? And we need to look at the kind of research that they're developing and the kind of language and narratives that are embedded in the kind of migration research that's going on, and what sort of global neo-colonial racist language that it reinforces, right? And so part of what I'm trying to understand is a little bit about the way in which in global discourses, African migration is being portrayed and denaturalized, and the way in which the figure, not just of the African migrant, not just of the person who is moving, but any African who might, for any reason, good or bad, even think about moving, is being moralized and is being seen as a potential threat, as a hazard, not just to themselves, because they're going to drown in the Mediterranean or get lost at sea, but as a threat to their country, to their family, and to the global political order and to progress, right? We can see some of this inadvertently in speeches, for example, from like Al Gore, right? And many other environmental activists who use the very threat of Black and brown people coming into your country as a way to draw attention to what issues that definitely need attention, the forthcoming environmental climatic catastrophe, right? But if you read this, it is the immigrants, not the environment in some ways, that are going to undermine democracy, or are going to undermine everything that the West has built up, everything that we value, right? This is incredibly irresponsible, but is something that is repeated over and over again in the environmental discourse, and then much more explicitly in many of the discourses that we see elsewhere, right? In which staying put is a natural thing for Africans, right? We see this very clearly in a lot of the African Union discussion, African solutions for Africans, stay home, build your country, but we're seeing it also very explicitly in European language, where African migration, or really migration from elsewhere in the world, is seen as bad for Africans, and it is seen particularly as bad for Europe or for the rest of the world, because these people are not ready to join the world. They are backwards, they are dangerous. The very fact that they want to leave when it is not legal to do so is a sign of their moral shortcomings, right? And if they come before we invite them, before they are ready, they are a threat to themselves and they are a threat to us, right? In doing so, Europe has invented a kind of, well, not invented, has, let's say, resuscitated a very colonial narrative, right? Which justifies intervention in Africa to save Africans from themselves, to get them ready to join the world, to culturalize them, to moralize them, to help them prepare themselves so that they will not continue to be a risk to themselves and to the rest of the world. They will not spread disease. They will not bring their predatory sexual habits elsewhere. They will learn to be good, law-abiding citizens that could then join the modern world with the rest of us, right? It's really remarkable. We've been doing more of this kind of analysis of contemporary and colonial narratives, and the kind of resonances are extraordinarily strong. And it seems that the Europeans saying them are extremely unself-conscious and unreflective about it. Or maybe they just don't care. Maybe they realize that they just don't care, right? But what this is justified from the European side, what becomes necessary, right? Not just out of cruelty, but what becomes a necessary component of this is the kind of performative, effective border work that many people have spoken about. So the deaths in the Mediterranean, the deaths in Agadez in Niger, we were hearing about that earlier, right, are something that has to happen to send a message to Africans that they shouldn't come. Because if they make it, it will only encourage more of them and they'll move badly, right? And so what's happening is it's not just a kind of performance from the European Union, but they are actively using in some ways we're all implicated in this, because every time we highlight these migrant deaths, every time we protest against the migrant deaths, as indeed we should, as is the right thing to do, we are helping to visibilize it. We're helping to spread the message that crossing is dangerous, that crossing will kill you, that crossing in the processes of stopping people may be wrong, but it is extremely risky. It's not to say that it is our fault that this is happening, but we have to recognize the way in which we are part of this narrative of spreading the news that moving is dangerous and moving is wrong, and you might lose your life, you might lose your son. What we're also seeing is, I think, a kind of broader process of what I've called pre-crime, which is an effort to pre-criminalize any African who thinks about moving so that they can be corrected before they move, right? And this is an image, those of you who are as old as I am will remember this movie when it came out, right? It's Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report, right? In which they build a very elaborate system to stop crimes before they start, right? And that is built on a whole range of techniques, particularly artificial intelligence and research across the African continent on Africans about what makes them moves, and most particularly, what sort of incentives can we provide to stop them from moving. Millions and millions of euros is being spent on research like this, somehow getting past the ethical review boards of universities and others, but to try to correct Africans so that they can behave better, so that ultimately they can be ready to join the world, right? And here we see an IOM-run sort of education program in Ghana, I think, where you train Africans about the evils of migration, where you train them that staying home is patriotic. It is what you need to do to support your family. It is how you build your country and how you can get ready to join a global future, right? We see newspaper ads, we see videos, we see a huge campaign around this, right? Part of this is continuing to be fed by all of the data that we collect, all of this sort of information that we feed into this European machine so that they can figure out how better to intervene across the continent. Many of the universities, my own, part of it, are part of doing this, part of collecting the data, part of feeding this machine. And indeed, what we see is part of spreading that message that immigration is dangerous, immigration is wrong, right? So just in wrapping up, and I think I'll finish on time, don't worry, right? I think that we are left with the question of what to do about this, right? And I think some of what we have done, this is now moving on its own, it's chasing me off the stage, is to really sort of celebrate, I think, the sort of storming of the gates, the people who are transgressive, crossing borders, this kind of illicit immigration. And I think there's something to celebrate there as delegitimizing the border. But if we look at what that does in terms of the narrative, is being instrumentalized against us. It is being used as proof that these immigrants are not law-abiding, that they don't recognize borders, that they are not coming invited. And that is part of why they need to be kept out, because they can't fit into our law-abiding civic liberal cultures, right? And so we have to think about, what do we do? Tendai Achume has made an argument that we should be advocating for immigration based on international immigration, based on retribution. England, France, Germany, others invested in Africa in a huge colonial enterprise, extracted huge amounts, are now very, very wealthy. Africans have a right to that wealth. This is a very powerful argument, and I think one that resonates, that we've seen this morning at a sort of national scale, at a kind of global scale. But her argument, and many of these arguments, are based on the idea of nation states interacting and engaging, and reinforce a broader colonial enterprise. They may help individuals, they may help some, but I think it doesn't go far enough. And I think where we need to go is to start thinking about how we talk about nation states, how we collect data, how we can do our research in ways that denaturalize the whole idea of the border, that show these kind of historical connections. And here we've been really inspired by some of the Pan-Africanists of Senghor, Cesar, who didn't advocate for national self-liberation. They recognized it's too late for that. The empire is real. What we need to do is think about how we claim rights within an empire, within spaces that are not bound by nation-state borders, that do not naturalize the idea that development is something that is done at a national level, but really is a global process. And it's for us, I think, as scholars, to help bring those out, to help bring out the kind of colonial resonances in contemporary language, in contemporary scholarship, in contemporary public policy, but also to be very careful about the epistemic apparatus that we use in conducting our own work, so we don't make those sorts of narratives even more powerful, right? So I'll just end there, hopefully on time. I won't get scolded, and I'll sit down and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Landau. I think it was great to also finish the last presentation with also raising this issue about the responsibility and role of scholars in countering dominant migration narratives. So I will now give the floor to you to ask any question you would like. And also I would like also to mention the fact that Yunus, my colleague Yunus Aouga, is also collecting the questions from the chat. So also on Zoom, feel free to write down your question in the chat so that we can then pick up your questions after that. So Anna, and then there.
I can help people gather their thoughts while I ask my first question. So the scope of this panel, and well, first of all, thank you all for very fascinating and very different presentations. And Loren, you managed to keep us awake with this. I mean, I was jealous of your PowerPoint, but the idea of this panel was that these are all emerging regional powers. And so what I heard from you is very interesting. Like Zeynep, I think, presented to us how Turkey is developing a narrative as a host country, while previously it was understanding more itself as an emigration or a transit country. I think Mehdi told us about how Morocco still sticks by the narrative of migration and development that is failed. Andrei, I think, gave us a good view of how the narrative of Russia on migration has changed, but actually, I would like to hear more about the narrative. I mean, I think it was very informative that you told us about what is happening, but a little bit more about the narrative, or even the absence of a narrative in Russia about either emigration or immigration. And Loren, obviously, your presentation was very powerful, also addressing our responsibility. But I would like to ask you, do you think that these four narratives are like I'm concerned myself about the global compact for migration. I think it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. The global compact is not as good as it should be, but it is what I see dangerous is promoting this narrative of safe, orderly, and regular migration. So the good migration is that one, and everything else is bad. So do you see that these narratives, each one, the narrative you presented, can contest that and give us a more plural view? Or do you see that all these four narratives of these, what I call regional emerging powers, are just confirming that?
Thank you. Binod, I thought you had a question over there.
Can I go?
So there are two actually. I don't know. Okay, so Harry, please.
Thank you for your fascinating presentations. So when it comes to the narratives, when we look at the countries of origin and the narratives about immigrants, the outgoing migrants, it's based on my lived experience and my research in South Asian context. There is a hierarchy. The migrants who go to the global north, migrating to the global north, Europe, North America, and Australia, they are considered to be perceived to be winners, but they are perceived in a different light. I mean, the migrants who go to other global south countries, for example, Middle East. So I think these narratives are constructed at the deeply rooted to neoliberal globalization and also colonial history. And also to some extent, the narratives, the transnational narratives that the ones who have already migrated to the global north, they are transmitting and sharing through social media. But I wonder if you could share in the context of South Africa, Turkey, and Morocco, the perceptions and the narratives about the outgoing, the immigrants. What are the narratives? How are they perceived by the people in the country of origin?
Thank you. And over there, you had, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the thoughtful presentations. My question, first of all, to Mehdi. I'm just thinking, I mean, we've spoken about the agency of the migrants themselves. I'm just thinking about what the grassroots activists are saying about Morocco's relationship and engagement with external forces in this migration circles. I mean, from what you have discussed, just to know what is the grassroots or migrants' agitation to that. And then secondly, it's on the Loren's presentation. So I see it more as, yes, talking about South Africa, but even within Africa, South Africans don't see themselves as Africans. You are in South Africa and they are telling you, I haven't been to Africa before. And so from that perspective, I see more of this discussion you gave as speaking to the north, moving from south to north migration, which we are trying to change the narrative that most people are south-south and not north-south. And so I just want to know from your perspective, changing the narrative and looking also at the context within, what would you say to that? I mean, moving away from what you have said, what would you say is happening within to not make the experts as maybe migration studies centers, as you said, as just condoning what's happening, but what are they doing to change the narratives? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll take also Binod, and then we'll go for a round of answers.
I think very, very provocative presentations, particularly Mehdi put it very mildly, whereas Loren has actually shared the stark picture. It made me think that the history repeats itself. In fact, this African story now perhaps was the same treatment was given to the Asian people more than 100 years ago. So 1917, the literacy test that was being enacted in the US was to stop the Indians, the Chinese, and the Fijians. And today they are welcomed. Why? Because they are not illiterate. If they have to stop them, they have to perhaps make a literacy test of PhD and postdoctoral levels. So that, I think, is not as simple as simply stopping everybody. it is high degree of selectivity. And that I think the narrative, in terms of narratives, when I think of the title of this particular conference, politics and policies, I think these narratives are being changed by politics, not by policies. And there is a great deal of hypocrisy, so to say, on our part also, that Loren has mentioned that we have to own up the responsibility of how we present or accept the narratives without contestation. That I think is one lesson that I draw from this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So first, maybe we can take Zeynep on Zoom, if you want to answer to some of the questions.
I can pick up two questions, and starting with Anna's question about to what extent these emerging powers can contest to the global compact. In the case of Turkey, I don't see that much, let's say, the willingness to be really contest to the compact. And actually, when you, not only in the Turkey case, but also in other cases like Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, I know that they really very seriously taking to the compact. And they are kind of, they're really trying to harmonize things through to the compact, and then also the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. And you see the trace of these two in their new policy or strategy papers. And I don't see that much contestation, but more I see the adaptation of this language and turning, their policies and playing with this language is also in order to, to negotiate sometimes with the donors as well. And regarding to the second question from the audience about these hierarchies of among immigrants and the narratives about, the immigrants, for the case of Turkey, I can tell that we don't have that much hierarchy for those who migrated to Europe or who migrated to, elsewhere. But the hierarchies is more or less more about those emigrated earlier, like in the 1960s, 1970s, as a labor migrants to Europe and mainly to Germany. And these are seen as a good immigrants because they were, they sent remittances and they were, very helpful to the development of the country in some sense. While those who migrated in the 1990s for political reasons, like asylum seekers from Turkey having a Kurdish origin or from an opposition groups, and these were more or less taken as a bad immigrants in a way that because it was believed they represent Turkey in a negative way. And as well as also this is true with this the very new way of the immigrants from Turkey right now, highly skilled immigrants, specifically engineers and the doctors and the academics in Turkey were leaving the country in the last 6 years. These immigrants are also not seen as that much, the good or representative face of the Turkey. As there is also this self-exiled component or, the fleeing from kind of authoritarian tendencies in the country, which has showing us that these immigrant narratives are not also static. They're also, the changing from one group to one, and also from who is at the power, who is the power holder in the country as well. And I'm going to stop here.
I did want to, for Morocco, to speak about three narratives. The narrative of the migrant in transit, and the resident migrant, and the political and economical approach of the Moroccan government. And that should be very long, a very, very narrative. It's a long story. Now, the first two narratives, it's are numerically, and when it comes to the number. In Morocco, we have about 150,000 resident migrants. It represents less than 0.5% of the whole population. And as they are in a regular situation, I think that they are happy there. They are happy there. It's Morocco. It looks like Spain. I don't know if you know Spain, Andalusia. And Andalus in Spain, you have beaches, you have snow, you have woods, you have forests, you have animals, you have a kind people, and no Moroccan living in a quiet, in a good situation is willing to leave Morocco. I don't want to leave Morocco, but I want to be free to move all around the world. As the European are moving, as the American are moving, there is a moral problem. It's a moral philosophical problem. Now, this is the first one. And this 150,000 people are living very happy. And some of them are living in irregular situation. People from France, some people from Spain, and as they are in free movement, they can change, they don't need visa, but they only have to cross the border between Morocco and Spain, about 14 kilometers, or only to go to cities of Ceuta and Melilla, which are occupied cities in Morocco, and to come back, to go in the morning and to come back in the afternoon, and they can say, but as they are blue, they are white with blue eyes, that are not considered as a regular migrant at all. Now, the second part is the migrant in transit. The migrant in transit are about same between 100,000 people and 100,000 people. They represent less than 0.30 of the whole population. And according to many field works we lead there in Morocco during all of these 20 last years, most of them are willing to cross, to go to Europe. And now what is happening, as I told you about before a moment, according to this pact of migration and asylum, the last one, our colleague spoke about, but we do have to protect Europe. We do have to put the army, police, the police authority forces, and about, let's say, about 2 to 3% of the public expenditure in Morocco to protect Europe. What is the counterpoint of that? We don't receive anything. There is free trade, and we don't have any return. And as you see, Morocco is not the only one country in such situation. We have to look in the western part of Europe, and the relationship between UK and France is exactly, between two developed countries, is exactly the same relationship between Morocco and Spain, between Morocco and Europe. And the UK is paying now about 600 million euros to France to protect the UK, to protect it. So we have the same, this is same approach. This is the same, and we can see that Europe is paying Morocco for just for helping him and for it, and for contributing to his expenditure. You have the same situation between these countries. I spoke about England and France. Now, when it comes to for this migration of transit, Morocco cannot do anything to integrate those population. It's a very poor country. It's about $3,000 per person and per year. And we have a lack of expenditure in health area, in education area. And so we cannot, for example, do the same thing that Turkey did with Syrian refugees, as Turkey received in 2016 in a deal with the European Union about 6 billion euros to give the Syrian refugees the opportunity to stay in dignity in Turkey. And we know that, as I spoke about the winner part of this problematic of migration, we know that Germany was the great winner of this what we called in 2015, 2016, the crisis of refugees. And we know that these Syrian refugees, there were many of them was young people, young man, young woman, doctors, engineers, statisticians, and they contribute for about 2 to 3% of the progression of the income of Germany. That means that they help, the Syrian refugees helped in a great part Germany to stay and to be till now the most important economical power in Europe. Now I come back to the compact of migration. We know that a lot of countries didn't sign this compact. The United States till now didn't do Austria, Algeria in Africa, and other countries. France also wasn't represented by its president there, and also the European Union. The signature of the European Union was something like a very formal one, but it's also incomplete. What is the option? The main important option is to give more opportunities to this chosen immigration. What our colleague this morning spoke about, these liberal regimes, pick and choose, pick and choose. In 1933, you told us that Europe gave Africa culture, civilization, but till now, Africa is still giving material raw, and this is about it. It appears in this option of pick and choose. This is the real approach of the European countries. Now in France, we are discussing about this les métiers sous tension. We will receive a population which will help us in agriculture, in restoration, in tourism, in sector, in health sector, but you have to take back all the other person that we don't have any need for them. It's a new law discussing, which will be discussed in July. Now they decided that will be discussed in July in France. So I come back to this compact. We have to add, as I told you before a moment, we have to add this option of reducing insecurity. Also, as we know now, that's the problematic of migration from Africa is also linked to the climate change. And no one is really interesting to do more that is still done till today, according to this phenomenon in Africa. And we know that even today, about 80 to 85% of the population in Africa are still staying in Africa. But tomorrow, this population should be higher. The number of these migrants should be higher than now. If we don't do anything in Africa according to the climate change, and we know that the most important responsible of the climate change, what's happening this change in Africa are the China, the Arabian countries of say the Qatar, Emirates, but also the European and the American, and no one is willing to do more in this issue. But the final one, you choose our high-skilled people. They contribute to your production. We know that some Africans don't have any skills, no doctor in countries like Namibia, like Djibouti. All the doctors of these countries are working in France, in Germany, in Italy. And we know in countries like Algeria or Tunisia or Morocco or Mali, about 20 to 40% of all the doctors are working in the countries of the OCDE. So they are contributing to create riches, to create opportunity of jobs, but there is no compensation according to that. We do have also to discuss within this global pact or another pact about which compensation we should. The winner of yesterday, these companies in building, in housing, in many other sectors, how they should help the country of departure to get in the way of development. I'm sorry.
Continue. I know, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. I'm going to be very quick on this. I promise. I think there's a question with the Global Compact. If we talk about safe and orderly, who is responsible for the safety? And that safety it's increasingly the migrants must protect themselves, right? Which means they shouldn't move because it's not safe to move. And which order are we talking about, right? And the order, I agree, there's nothing wrong with orderly migration, but right now, if we look at the order that is being pushed across the African continent, it is one in which migration cannot effectively happen, right? If we take, for example, the 2015 law in Niger, which was pushed by the European Union as a condition, basically to outlaw all form of smuggling, and in the 2020 pact, right, with Africa, all smuggling is trafficking and is hence criminal. We see basically, because you can't get documents, you can't move legally, everyone who moves is a criminal, right? And Senegal recently convicted a father because he helped sponsor his son's journey to Europe and the son died. So he's being held responsible as an accessory to a murder, right? This is the order that is being implicated, right? In which migration is so moralized or demoralized, if it's a word, right? In which everyone who might move, right, is considered a criminal before they've even gone anywhere, right? So yes, orderly migration is fine, safe migration is fine, but who is responsible for that and what order is it preserving? And I think we see, Mary, to your question, African states have been bought off. The AU trying to promote free movement in the continent. The African states are like, we already made a deal with the EU. So sorry, it's a great idea. We like your Pan-African ideals, but we're gonna do this. We're gonna work for the French. We're gonna work for the British. We're gonna make a deal with the UK to take the rejected asylum seekers. Or the University of Nairobi's Migration Studies Center is gonna basically work with MI5 and the CIA at the airport to help do forensic investigations into illegal immigration and terrorism, right? That is what's happening. And so I think that's what, when we talk about the order and safety, I think we have to be very careful about what that means in practice.
Well, the most interesting thing about the narratives in Russia is the absence of a single narrative. It's in constant flux. And if we talk about immigration, it evolved from the idea that we don't want anybody. Russia adopted a zero option. In other words, anybody who lived at the moment of dissolution in its territory was entitled to citizenship. And this is it. Then there started flows of refugees, of people who simply were migrating from other post-Soviet states. And step by step, it started to evolve. We want Russians, then we want Russian speakers, then we want anybody from the former Soviet territory. Colleague referred here to Syrians in Germany. At the moment of the USSR dissolution, there were about 150,000 Afghans living in Russia. Practically all of them were affiliated with the Najibullah regime. That means that they were pro-Russian. Many received education at Russian universities, and many were fluent in Russian. Practically not a single one of them received permanent status in Russia. They all had to go to the third countries. The current model is there is an understanding that Russia both lacks labor resources and demographic resources. And therefore, numerous programs were created to, on the hand, lure professionals. About 20,000 come right now through the professionally qualified migration quota. And overall, about 250,000 come on an annual basis. I'm speaking before February 2022 as temporary labor migrants. So state is in a constant struggle between the realization that migrants are necessary both for demographic and labor market reasons, and the resistance that comes from officials at all levels. And the irony is that on the one hand, Putin has a legal education and is surrounded by people with legal education. And it's a plus because during his tenure, at least legal basis was developed for migration policies. On the other hand, he is surrounded by people like him from law enforcement and from secret police, who from the very start have kind of prohibitive mentality. And all this influences the situation and creates a constant tension between the realization by the elite of the need for migrants and their operational codes and the easiness of playing the migrant card in terms of support consolidation. In regard to out-migration, I left the Soviet Union yet in 1990, so 1 year before the USSR dissolution. The initial model was go and forget about you. Then the same way there comes a realization that it might be a useful tool, not only political, but in terms of brain gain. So with Medvedev's tenure in the 2010s, there starts a very aggressive work trying to, lure in brains educated in the West. Numerous programs are created. And then there comes the war. I already mentioned that there's a result of the war, about 500,000 have left. Mostly these are young people with university education and mostly young males. It is highly disproportionate. And there's a very interesting mixed narrative. On the one hand, it's really good that these guys are leaving. Most of them are liberals anyway, so it consolidates support. Lukashenko in Belarus spelled it out openly. He said, well, let's get rid of this garbage. On the other hand, there is also a realization that these are elites, plus this is potential cannon powder. So there are numerous measures are taken to prevent people from leaving. So that there is, again, not only the fact that narratives are in flux, but they're also mixed. There is no single clearly defined policy. The only area where the policy is very clear and very prohibitive is the transit migration. So these migrants are not welcome in any way or form, and there are pretty harsh policies, against any types of transit migration.
Thank you very much. So we have actually gone past the time of our panel. So I'm sorry for those who had questions. I will invite you to keep them and ask them during the break, which will happen just now. So I wanted to first thank very much all the presenters for their great presentations and for the public also and the questions. Thank you very much.